Buenos días, tardes y noches a todos los que ven este video. Con ustedes, Víctor Telles. Esta transmisión, continuando con el estudio de Flavio Josefo en inglés, ya que esta semana está dedicada a Flavio Josefo en inglés. Esta transmisión ya la había dado yo en español. Aquí abajo, en el enlace que se encuentra aquí abajo, ya he transmitido en español capítulo 3 y el capítulo 4. Ya vimos el capítulo 3 en inglés, hoy vamos a ver el capítulo 4 que está hacia la parte final del enlace de aquí abajo. Empezado ahí por el minuto 40, por el minuto 50 más o menos. Saludos a Librería Guadalupana Nuevo Amanecer. This week, today we will continue with the English transmission of Flavius Josephus. This week is dedicated to we are focusing on Flavius Josephus. Why is it so important that we focus on Flavius Josephus? Well, anybody who knows anything about the study of the Bible, about a real study of New Testament times, dedicates time to studying about Flavius Josephus. The reason being is that Flavius Josephus was a historian who lived in the 1st century in Israel. He lived firsthand. He's a first-hand account of what was going on. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, yesterday, and several times, when you study Flavius Josephus, it is important. When you study the Bible, it's important to study Flavius Josephus. The Old Testament, depending whether you use a Catholic or the Protestant Bible, leaves anywhere between 160 years to 400 years of a gap by the end of the Old Testament. And then all of a sudden you start with the New Testament, 160 to 100 to 400 years later. What happened in between? That's the reason why the sola scriptura lie does not stand. What? Did the Persian Empire miraculously become the Roman Empire? Did the Maccabees magically become the Roman Empire? Of course not. There was a process in which the Maccabees rose to power. There was a process in which the Maccabees fell from power. And there was a process in which Rome rose to power. And all that is explained through Flavius Josephus. But the detail with him is he likes to be very detailed in his explanation of things. Now, last time we saw Flavius Josephus, 2 days ago, we were at the 4th generation after the Maccabees. You see, in around 164, the Maccabees rise to fight against Antiochus Epiphanes, who had persecuted the Jews. And the 4th generations after the Maccabees rose to power, let's look at some, let's try and look at, whatchamacallit. Let's try to look at what at the family tree of the Maccabees. Here you have the family tree of the Maccabees. The first 4 generations, at least. There were still 2 other generations after this, but for what we're seeing now, this is the family tree. Maccabees were starting in 167 to fight against what Antiochus Epiphanes the 4th was trying to do, forcing the Jews to sacrifice a pigs, committing sacrilege. So Mattathias and his 5 sons rise up to fight against the evils of the Greek Syrian Empire. But around the 3rd generation, with the time of John Hyrcanus, all that zeal to fight for God disappears. Now, Johnny Hyrcanus, who was born not with the name John Hyrcanus, but Yehonan Hyrcanus, changes his name to Johannes, the Greek, with the Greek form of John, and calls himself a prince. And then he betrays the trust of the religious community by invading the temple, invading David's tomb, getting out the gold coins, and then taking it to the Greek Syrians who were oppressing them. By the time it came to, afterwards, we saw that John Hyrcanus, when he died, he had 5 children. Aristobulus and Antigonus, we saw their rule. Last time we saw how Aristobulus shared his power with Antigonus, but there was intrigues, and the queen, Alexandra Salome, Aristobulus's wife, had, through intrigues, gets them both killed and frees Alexander Jannaeus from prison. Now, this is where we left off, the year 103. Now, let's continue with where we left off. We were about to start the 4th chapter of the War of the Jews, written by Flavius Josephus. Follow along with me, if you will. And now the king's wife, this is Queen Alexandra Salome, who ruled first. She was queen from the year 104 BC to the year 76 BC. She was first married to Aristobulus, whom she had killed. And then she married Alexander Jannaeus. And then after Alexander Jannaeus, she ruled independently for a time. But while she was getting firm in her power, she used the 2 brothers, first Aristobulus and then Alexander Jannaeus. Remember, Aristobulus had imprisoned his mother and his 3 younger brothers, Alexander Jannaeus and 2 others who history does not identify. Now, the king's wife lose the king's brethren and make King Alexander king. This is Alexander Jannaeus. He appeared both elder and more moderate in his temper than the rest. That means older than the other 2 who were also in prison. So after Aristobulus died, Queen Alexandra Salome goes down, frees Alexander Jannaeus, and since he was the 3rd oldest, the 2 oldest ones had died, so he was the 3rd oldest, she marries Alexander Jannaeus when she frees him, and she frees the other 2. When he came to the government, slew one of his brethren as affecting to govern himself, but had the other of them in great esteem, as living a quiet life without meddling in public affairs. So, when Alexandra Salome marries her brother-in-law, Alexander Jannaeus, having risen to the position of king, he became very zealous of that position. And noticing that one of his other brothers was trying to make a name for himself, Alexander Jannaeus has him killed. The youngest one, realizing this, decides not to pursue political office. So Alexander Jannaeus spares his life. This, as we notice, is happening in the year 103 BC. Now it happened that there was a battle. Okay, now we transition from Israel into Egypt. You see, as Israel is going through this civil war between the children of John Hyrcanus, the intrigue between Aristobulus, Antigonus, Alexander Jannaeus, Alexandra Salome, well, there's all that intrigue going on, and a type of civil war, if you would please, because our civil war is actually beginning among the Maccabees. At the same time, um, in Egypt, as well as in Greek Syria, there are also civil wars taking place. So now Flavius Josephus takes us to the civil war in Greece and explains us what's going on there, as it will be necessary to know this to follow along with this chapter. Now it happened that there was a battle between him and Ptolemy, who was called Lathyrus. This is Ptolemy the Ninth. Ptolemy the Ninth lived around the time that is known to us as, let's see, Ptolemy the Ninth was in power. Okay, bear with me. Ptolemy the Ninth was in power around the 130. No, wait. Excuse me. My information is a bit slow. Yes, he was in power from 116 through 107 BC. Then he loses power in 107 BC due to the civil war that's going on in Egypt. And then 88 through 81 BC, he recovers power once again. Now you see, he is fighting against Ptolemy the Eighth, who's a sibling of his, as well as against his own mother, Cleopatra the Third. He says, who had taken Lathyrus. This is Lathyrus, who had taken Azoches, and indeed slew a great many of his enemies. But the victory rather inclined to Ptolemy. But when this Ptolemy, Lathyrus the Ninth, was pursued by his mother Cleopatra the Third, this is not the famous Cleopatra with Julius Caesar. She comes in yet another 60 years later. This is Cleopatra's great grandmother, another Cleopatra the Third, retired into Egypt. So Cleopatra the Third defeats her son Lathyrus, and Lathyrus, Ptolemy the Ninth, flees after having taken some cities from the possession of the Maccabees. Alexander besieged Gadara and took it, as also he did Amathus, which was the strongest of all the fortresses that were about the Jordan. Now, these territories were controlled by the Maccabees. So, Ptolemy Lathyrus IX, having been defeated by his mother, Cleopatra III, he decides to attack the territories that the Maccabees controlled on the eastern side of the Jordan River. He takes some of those cities because throughout that whole issue, what Alexander Jannaeus and Alexander Salome were doing, they neglected the defense of the towns east of the Jordan. Let's see. And therein were the most precious of all possessions of Theodorus, the son of Zeno. Now that Ptolemy the Ninth Lathyrus took some territories from the hands of the Maccabees on the east of the river Jordan, the Greek Syrians, from which the Maccabees fought for independence, were also possessing some towns in that region. By this time, the third great grandson of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, this guy by the name of Theodorus, is on that side. Now, during this time, there's also another civil war going on between the Syrian Greeks. Theodorus is fighting the Demetrius, I forget if it's Demetrius the second or Demetrius the third. There's a battle going on right there. So you have a civil war in Egypt, a civil war in Greek Syria, and a civil war in Israel. 3 civil wars going on. This is a free-for-all. Let's see. Whereupon Theodorus marched against him and took what belonged to him, as well as the king's baggage, and slew 10,000 of the Jews. Now, the Greek Syrian Theodorus, after Ptolemy the Ninth, Lathyrus takes some of the towns that were ruled by the Greek Syrians. The Greek Syrians, ruled by Theodorus, declare war on both the Maccabees, the Jewish Maccabees, and the Egyptian. Theodorus takes back the Syrians the towns that Ptolemy took away from him, and then decides to fight against the Maccabees to try and reclaim some of the territory that the Maccabees had freed. That's why Theodorus decides to attack and kill many of the Jews. However, Alexander recovered this blow and turned his force towards the maritime parts and took Raphia and Gaza, and Anthedon also, which was afterwards called Agrippa by King Herod. So now the Maccabees respond. They fight back against the Greeks and against the Egyptians. And as they're fighting back against Theodorus, they come back and they take Gaza and Raphia, which were then controlled by the Egyptians. Notice one thing that is very important to keep in mind here. We are talking about a battle that took place in 103 BC. We're noticing that already in 103 BC, there was already an Israel, which was being controlled by the Maccabees. Also, notice that in this chapter, nowhere does it address the word Palestine. Israel existed in this time of the Maccabees, but Palestine did not exist. There wasn't even a term called Palestine. Nowhere will you ever find in the book of the Maccabees such a word as Palestine, because Palestine never existed. The word itself, Palestine, was invented 200 years after after these events we're talking about, by a Roman emperor who wanted to exercise genocide against the Jews. By Roman Emperor Hadrian is the one who invented the term Palestine. Notice it was not an Arab. Notice it was not a native of that region. He was a Roman emperor who invented the word Palestine. And then Britain and France continue using that term, European powers. And notice who is supporting those who hate the Jews? Greek invaders. And today, who is supporting the Palestinian cause? A European organization called the United Nations. Europeans. So the Palestinian, and later on in the 1940s, who supports the Palestinian cause? A European by the name of Adolf Hitler. So all along the Palestinian cause has all been pushed by Europeans who want to manipulate the issues in Israel. The Palestinian cause is not a native cause. It is an imperialistic cause. And we find that it does not exist at any moment in ancient history. Only Israel existed. And notice here it mentions that the Maccabees go on and invade Gaza and Rafah, places where Israel is fighting right now again. But who did Gaza and Rafah belong to? They belonged to Egypt. They belonged to Egypt, and they had been invaded by Greek Syrians. It was not Gaza was not called Palestine. Gaza was called Egypt. Let's continue. Paragraph 3. When he had made the slaves of the citizens of all these cities, that is, Alexander Jannaeus enslaves the population of those areas in response to Ptolemy's attack of Jewish territories. The nation of the Jews, Israel, made an insurrection against him at a festival, for at those feasts, seditions were generally begun. You see now what's going on is this. Alexander Jannaeus, now we're talking about the time about 76 BC. Alexander Jannaeus has been in power for about 30 years now. Alexander Jannaeus was known for his cruelty. So his own people, the Jews, decide to rebel against him. And when during a festival, you see in Jewish custom, they had the tradition of making 3 pilgrimages a year to Jerusalem. That was during Passover, during the Feast of Pentecost, and during the Feast of Tabernacles. They were expected to go up to Jerusalem. You had then Jews from all over the world during these 3 festivals. So it was common for many people to take advantage of these festivals to recruit people for a cause. And this time the cause was a cause to liberate themselves from the evil rule of Alexander Jannaeus. And it looked as if he should not be able to escape the plot they had laid for him, had not his foreign auxiliaries, Pisidians and Cilicians, assisted him. For as to the Syrians, he never admitted them among his mercenary troops on account of their innate enmity against the Jewish nation. Okay, so now we see that Alexander Jannaeus is about to be ousted. His own people, the Jews of Israel, rise up against him, and they're about to get him out of there. But notice who helps and defends the cause of Alexander Jannaeus. Pisidians and Cilicians. These are the people who live in what is now Turkey. We notice here once again that it is the foreign powers who support and tolerate dictatorships, or in this case, corrupt kings in that region. Turkey, known in the time of the Maccabees as Pisidians and Cilicians, among other Lydians, are the ones who are supporting the evil king Alexander Jannaeus. Just like once again today, the Turkish president is supporting the terrorists of Gaza. He never admitted, but we also see another thing. Alexander Jannaeus does not let Greek Syrians join his forces. Remember, this is only 4 generations after the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His grandfather, his own grandfather, is the one who helped get rid of the rule of all the Greeks in the area who were persecuting the Jews. That's why Alexander did not trust the Greek Syrians, but he trusted the Pisidians and the Cilicians because these countries also fought to get rid of the power of Antiochus Epiphanes. 4 generations early. When he had slain more than, oh, by the way, and remember, they're also fighting against Theodorus, who was then ruling the Greek Syrians. Once more, another reason why he did not trust the Greek Syrians. And when he had slain more than 6,000 of the rebels, he made an incursion into Arabia. And when he had taken that country, together with Gileadites and Moabites, he enjoined them to pay him tribute and return to Aresius. As Theodorus was surprised at these great successes, he took the fortress and demolished it. Now, Alexander Gennaeus, having taken Raphia from Egypt, having taken Gaza from Egypt, he goes on to Arabia, takes the Moabites. The Moab region is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, right next to the Dead Sea. Right now, if we were to travel to Israel, you would see that right across from where people are tend to baptize themselves, next to the Jordan River, there is another, on the eastern bank. There is a church right now. That church stands exactly where the country of Moab existed. It would be there, and it would extend further on south from there to what is now the borders between Jordan and Arabia. So he took that region, and then it also says he took the region of the Gileadites. The Gilead is a region northern of Israel, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which is the area that today Syria and Israel are fighting for. This area that is right at the foot of Mount Hermon. Now, Theodorus, king of the Greek Syrians, is impressed by what Alexander Gennaeus was able to do. So he establishes and decides to take a fortress that belonged to Alexander Gennaeus and destroy it as a way of trying to intimidate Alexander Gennaeus so that he does not attack Theodorus. However, when he fought with Obodas, king of the Arabians, remember he attacked Arabia, the Arabians controlled the region of Moab. They were also known as the Nabateans. They had their capital in what is now Pella. Some of the ruins around that region were the capital of the Nabateans, also known as the Arabians, who had controlled Moab until Alexander Gennaeus snatches it from him. And the king of these Arabians was Obodas, who had laid an ambush for him near Golan, and a plot against him. He lost his entire army, which was crowded together in a deep valley and broken to pieces by a multitude of camels. Now, Alexander Gennaeus was getting a lot of victories. He was beating Obodas, king of the Arabians. Obodas, let's see if I can tell you when Obodas ruled. Obodas, let's see. Obodas ruled from 96 BC to 85 BC. So we see this battle is taking place during that time. Now, we're talking about the 80s, around 80 BC is the time we're talking about. Obodas ambushes Alexander Jannaeus, and this ambush was so successful because now Alexander Jannaeus is left without an army. This army that was bringing victories to Alexander Jannaeus now did not exist anymore. Obodas goes to the extreme north, the region around the Golan, where the Gileadites were, right on the border with the territories of the Greek Syrians. Obodas goes right into a very narrow valley, and as the forces of Alexander Jannaeus were about to attack another territory, the Arabian king's army surprises Alexander Jannaeus' army and destroys them. Since this valley was so narrow, the army of Alexander Jannaeus had no mobility and they are crushed. Only Alexander Jannaeus escapes successfully. So this marks the beginning of the end of Alexander Jannaeus. When he had made his escape to Jerusalem, he provoked a multitude which hated him before to make an insurrection against him, and this on account of the greatness of the calamity that he was under. In other words, the very same people who had tried to rise up against him earlier unsuccessfully, seeing that Alexander Jannaeus has no army, they take advantage to try and overthrow Alexander Jannaeus. However, he was too hard for them, and in several battles that were fought on both sides, he slew not fewer than 50,000 of the Jews in the interval of 6 years. Remember, Alexander Jannaeus did not only have his army helping him. So Alexander Jannaeus goes back to Jerusalem without his Jewish army, but he still had the support of his European allies, the Pisidians and the Cilicians. And with their help, he smashes the hopes of those who were rising up against him. Yet he had no reason to rejoice in these victories, since he did not but consume his own kingdom, till at length he left off fighting and endeavored to come to a position with them. It takes its toll. Since Alexander Jannaeus was fighting without a Jewish army, he was using pretty much his allies' army. His own people were getting further and further away from him. They did not like Alexander Jannaeus as it is. Now Alexander Jannaeus is using European forces to try and help him recover. Well, the people of Jerusalem hated him more and more. So as he was winning back the control of the area, he was losing the trust of his own people. Let's see. So he decided to figure out another way to win back their hearts. And when he asked them why they hated him so and what he should do to appease them, they said by killing himself. For that it would be the best all they could do to reconcile with him who had done such tragical things to them. Even when he was dead, at the same time, they invited Demetrius, who was called Usurus, to assist them, and he readily complied with their request in hopes of great advantages, and came with the army. The Jews joined with those their auxiliaries about Shechem. Now, see what's going on right now. Alexander Jannaeus, finally, depressed, he's asking the Jews, why do you hate me? It's obvious. The crimes that Alexander Jannaeus committed against his own people. So now Alexander Jannaeus rises up and says, what can I do to get back your trust? His people says, well, if you want to get back our trust, go kill yourself. That's how much they ended up hating Alexander Jannaeus. They thought that for Israel to be in better conditions, their own king, Alexander Jannaeus, needed to be dead. Things were so bad for Alexander Jannaeus and for the condition of Israel, they go and establish an alliance with Demetrius III. And this is very significant, telling us how bad that situation was. You have Alexander Jannaeus, who is the great grandson of the great Maccabees who fought against the Greek Syrians and betrayed the cause of the Maccabees with the corruption of their rule of the great grandson Alexander Jannaeus. 4 generations earlier, the great Maccabees were fighting against the evil of Antiochus Epiphanes for their rights to survive and the rights to worship freely. But now the great grandson of the great Maccabees, Alexander Jannaeus, betrays the cause of the Maccabees, and in his ambition for power, he ends up killing many of his own people, to the point that now his own people go back to Demetrius, who's a relative of the royal family of the Greek Syrians, who just 4 generations earlier wanted to enslave them. Now they are joining the Greek Syrians to be freed. 4 generations earlier, the Greek Syrians represented slavery for the Jews. But now that things had gotten so bad that now the Greek Syrians represented freedom for the Jews, because they wanted to liberate themselves from an evil king such as Alexander Jannaeus. And they called forth to Demetrius, who belonged to the line of the Greek Syrians. Remember, I told you that there was a civil war going on among the Greek Syrians? Well, that civil war had 3 branches. On one side, there was Theodorus, who we spoke about earlier, and on the other side, you had Demetrius. And you also had another Antiochus. So you had 3 different Greek Syrian armies fighting each other. So the people of Jerusalem asked Demetrius for help, and he asked Demetrius for help, and in opposition to Theodorus and to their own king, Alexander Jannaeus. Yet did Alexander meet both these forces with 1,000 horsemen, 8,000 mercenaries that were on foot. These were the European mercenaries sent by Cilician and Pisidians. Remember, Alexander Jannaeus was fighting without his own army because Obotas, king of the Arabians, had demolished it. So now Alexander Jannaeus only has Pisidian and Cilician forces to help him. His own Jewish people refused to follow him, and they joined the forces of Demetrius. So you have Alexander Jannaeus fighting against his own people to try and recover their rule. Imagine. Imagine being things being so bad that you needed to hire an army from a foreign country to help conquer your own people. While the adverse party had 300,000 horsemen, 14,000 footmen. Now, before they joined battle, the kings made proclamation and endeavored to draw off each other's soldiers and make them revolt. So, Alexander Jannaeus makes a proclamation to try and recover his own people, while Demetrius, uh, who was a Greek, was trying to persuade the Pisidians and the Cilicians, who, even though they were enemies of the Greek Syrians, they still had Greek ancestry. So Demetrius is trying to recruit members of the Pisidian and Cilician armies that are fighting for Alexander Jannaeus to switch sides to him. And Alexander Jannaeus is trying to persuade the Jews back to him. While Demetrius hoped to induce Alexander's mercenaries to leave him, Alexander hoped to induce the Jews that were with Demetrius to leave him. But since neither the Jews would leave off their rage, nor the Greeks proved unfaithful, they came to an engagement and to a close fight with their weapons, in which battle Demetrius was the conqueror. Demetrius slaughtered Alexander Jannaeus. Although Alexander's mercenaries showed the greatest exploit, both in soul and body, yet did the offshoot of his battle prove different from what was expected as to both of them, for neither did those that invited Demetrius to come to them continue firm to him, though he was a conqueror, and 6,000 Jews, out of pity to the change of Alexander's condition, when he was fled to the mountains, came over to him. Yet could not Demetrius bear this turn of affairs, but supposing that Alexander was already become a match for him again, and that all the nation would at length run to him, he left the country and went his way. We see him. Demetrius slaughters the army that was being led by Alexander Jannaeus, thanks to the Jews who had joined forces with Demetrius. But now, at this point, those same Jews who were fighting against Alexander Jannaeus, all of a sudden they felt sorry for that very king they hated, because he lost so miserably to Demetrius. These Jews, having felt that they finally taught Alexander Jannaeus a lesson, and fearing that Demetrius would make the same crimes against the Jews as his great 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 grandfather Antiochus Epiphanes had done, they switched back to Alexander Jannaeus. Demetrius realizes this. Demetrius won Alexander Jannaeus thanks to the Jews. But these Jews were now switching back to their real king, Alexander Jannaeus. Demetrius realizes that even though he has won the war, now he's losing the Jewish contingency of his army. Now he flees. However, the rest of the Jewish multitude did not lay aside their quarrels with him when the foreign auxiliaries were gone, but they had a perpetual war with Alexander until he had slain the greater part of them and driven the rest into the city of Barnacelis. And when he had demolished that city, he carried captives to Jerusalem. All right. Now, the Jews who had joined Demetrius had switched back, thinking that that they had taught Alexander Jannaeus a lesson. But as soon as Demetrius' army leaves, Alexander Jannaeus goes back to his evil plans. The people of Jerusalem, knowing that they were instrumental in helping Demetrius defeat Alexander Jannaeus, know that they have quite a strength to them. So they continue fighting Alexander Jannaeus. So it's still a civil war going on. Alexander Jannaeus against his own people. And Alexander Jannaeus starts enslaving his own people. Nay, his rage was grown so extravagant as that barbarity proceeded to the degrees of impiety. Quite the opposite. Instead of this defeat, changing the evil ways of Alexander Jannaeus, Alexander Jannaeus became even worse. Now Alexander Jannaeus starts taking a vengeance against the very Jews who had joined Demetrius, even after they have switched back to his side. For when he had ordered 800 to be hung upon crosses in the midst of the city, he had the throat of their wives and children cut before their eyes, and these executions he saw as he was drinking and lying down with his concubines. This is how evil Alexander Jannaeus' way of life was. When he took prisoner the very same people who had switched back to him from Demetrius, he had them nailed on crosses. Many times we think that the people who invented crucifixion were the Romans, but we found that Alexander Jannaeus was the one who had started the tradition way before the Romans. The Romans were not in the picture yet. So as the men were hanging on the crosses, dying a slow, painful, and shameful way, without them being able to do anything, Alexander Jannaeus would bring the wife and the children of these prisoners who were hanging on the cross, and right in front of the cross, just as the wife and children were seeing their husbands and fathers dying on the crosses, so too these fathers were seeing their wives and their children being beheaded in front of them. So both the men see their families killed before their eyes, just the same way the families are seeing their fathers, brothers, and husbands killed in front of their eyes. And while he's doing all this, he's over here partying with his concubines. He's over here going to bed with all these other women, partying, and while he's celebrating the death of his own people. Upon which so deep a surprise seized on the people that 8,000 of his opposers fled away the very next night out of Judea, whose flight was only terminated by Alexander's death. So at last, though not till late and with great difficulty, he by such actions procured quiet to his kingdom and left off fighting anymore. So during this time, a lot of the people who hated Alexander Jannaeus, they were now afraid for their lives. And many of them, wanting to protect their families, they start leaving Jerusalem until one significant day in 76 BC, Alexander Jannaeus dies. Yet did that Antiochus, who was also called Dionysius, become an origin of troubles again. Dionysius, remember I told you there was a war between the Greek Syrians. Dionysius was one of these Greek Syrians. It was Dionysius against uh, Demetrius against Theodorus. Those were the three Greek Syrian armies that were fighting each other. Now Demetrius is starting to become stronger, and Dionysius gets even stronger than Demetrius. Dionysius, being the strongest of the three Greek Syrian armies, comes back and they start establishing trouble again against the Jews, just like their great grandfather Antiochus IV Epiphanes had done. This man was the brother of Demetrius, the same Demetrius who, you see what's going on? Demetrius and Dionysius are brothers, and Theodorus is a cousin of theirs. So you have the two brothers, Demetrius and Dionysius, fighting each other for the throne that had belonged to their father, who was, by the way, also called Dionysius. This is Dionysius the third, fighting his brother Demetrius the second, and they're fighting over the throne of Demetrius the second. And their cousin Theodorus is also trying to get a claim at the throne. So the Jews, when they joined forces with the Greek Syrians, they joined forces with um, uh, Demetrius, They joined forces with Demetrius because they knew that the Dionysius would go back to the same habit of Antiochus Epiphanes. And they thought that Demetrius, who, by the way, was fighting against his own brother Dionysius, that would be a safer way to go. But now, when Demetrius won, the Jews went back to Alexander Jannaeus in case Demetrius ended up losing the war to Dionysius. But yet we see now that there is a problem now. Alexander Jannaeus has died. Now there's a problem as who's going to take over Alexander Jannaeus' throne. And the civil war gets even worse because you have Alexander Jannaeus had two kids, also called Antiochus and Aristobulus, just like his father and just like his two uncles, Aristobulus and Antigonus. So too, Alexander has two kids, Aristobulus and Antigonus, who start fighting for the kingdom. But while that happens, this guy here, Dionysius, takes advantage of that civil war and takes over some Jewish land and starts committing the same crimes his ancestor Antiochus Epiphanes IV had done. And the last of the, let's see, the last of the branch of the rulers, the last ruler of the Greek Syrians. Alexander was afraid of him. Alexander Jannaeus was afraid of Dionysius. Well, he had just lost a war with his weaker brother Demetrius. And when he was marching against the Arabians, so he cut a deep trench between Antipatris. Antipatris is now known as Acre, which was near the mountains and the shores of Joppa, now Tel Aviv. He also erected a high wall before the trench and built wooden towers in order to hinder any sudden approaches. So, trying to slow down Dionysius, he established his trenches and walls between the regions of Tel Aviv and Acre, the coastal areas of Galilee, around Mount Carmel. He did this during the time that Dionysius was fighting the Arabians. So while Dionysius was fighting east of the Jordan, way far west, Alexander Jannaeus is trying. This is during the last days of his kingdom. He's trying to block off the advance of the Greek Syrians into Jewish territory. But still, he was not able to exclude Antiochus or Dionysius, for he burnt the towers and filled up the trenches and marched on with his army, as he looked upon taking his revenge on Alexander for endeavoring to stop him, and as a thing of less consequence. He marched directly against the Arabians, whose king retired into such parts of the country as were fittest for engaging the enemy alive. So, uh, Demetrius decides to take on the Arabians and Alexander Jannaeus. These two, having been enemies, they don't join forces to fight against Dionysius. The Arabians and Alexander Jannaeus are enemies, and Demetrius takes advantage of this enmity to take them both on. We usually hear, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Not in this case. The enemy of my enemy is still my enemy. And since Alexander Jannaeus tried to slow the forces of Dionysius, Dionysius got angry, and when he attacked the forces of Alexander Jannaeus, he attacked with a vengeance. He marched directly against the Arabians, whose king retired. So now, in the meantime, Obodas, the king of the Arabians, tries to establish another ambush. So Obodas, king of the Arabians, retreats to find a place to establish another ambush against Dionysius, as he had previously done with Alexander Jannaeus. Um, let's see. Declared, but taking his enemy. Oops, excuse me. I don't know what happened here. I actually pressed something. We are book 1, chapter 4, paragraph 7. Enemy. And then of a sudden turned back, which were the number of 1,000, and fell upon Antiochus's army while they were in disorder, and the terrible battle ensued. Antiochus's troops, so long as he was alive, fought it out, although a mighty slaughter was made among them by the Arabians. But when he fell, for he was in the forefront, in the utmost danger, in rallying his troops, they all gave ground, and the greatest part of the army were destroyed, either in the action of or the flight. For the rest who fled to the village of Cana, it happened that they were all consumed by the want of necessities, a few only excepted. So the Arabians moved back as Alexander Jannaeus was trying to slow and stop Dionysius from taking over the land. The Arabians, having invaded Jewish territory, taking advantage of the weakness of Alexander Jannaeus' hired army, the Arabians established an ambush. Dionysius pursues the Arabian army into the valleys around the region which is later on called Galilee, and they ambush the Greek Syrian army that was led by Dionysius. They were finally able to defeat Dionysius. Where Alexander Jannaeus had failed, Obodas succeeded. And now, the last Greek Syrian ruler who hated the Jews, is slaughtered by the Arabians. And it tells us that this happens around the city of Cana, the very same Cana where 100 years later, Jesus turns water into wine. About this time, it was that the people of Damascus, the capital of Dionysius and the Greek Syrians, out of their hatred to Ptolemy, the son of Menahem, invaded Aretas. Now, this is Aretas the second. Aretas is Obodas' son. Obodas, remember, was a king of the Arabians. When Obodas dies, his son, Aretas II, takes over as a new king. So during this time, few years later, when Obodas had died and Aretas was finally ruling, something happens. Let's see what happens. We see that these civil wars, they're fighting not only amongst themselves. So we see an all-out war. We see Syrian against Syrian, against Syrian, against Jews, against Pisidians, against Cilicians, against Egyptians, against Egyptian, against Arabs. You had what? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different armies all fighting against each other. And these people, the Greek Syrians, had ancient problems with the Egyptians. Remember, back in the time of Alexander the Great, Syria and Egypt were united under the rule of Alexander the Great. But when Alexander the Great died, the armies of Seleucus were fighting against the army of Ptolemy for control of that land. This was 200 years earlier. So by this time, the Greek Syrians and the Egyptians had spent 200 years fighting each other to try and reconquer the territory that had once belonged to Alexander the Great. So now, Dionysius returns to his capital, Damascus. Years later, the son of Obodas, Aretas, joins his father's enemies in a fight against Egypt. So they invited Aretas and made him king of Celesyria. So Celesyria is the southern part of what is now the country of Syria and the Lebanon. So in order to establish an alliance between the Arabians and the Greek Syrians give part of their territory to the Arabians to seal off a peace treaty against the Egyptians. The man also made an expedition against Judea and beat Alexander in battle. So now, notice what was going on earlier. The Arabians, during the time of King Obodas, the Arabians were fighting against the Greek Syrians, and the Jews were also fighting against the Greek Syrians. The Greek Syrians realized that the Jews are weak. They were weak at that point, at least. And the Arabians, these people knew how to fight. So when Obodas dies and his son Aretas takes over, the Greek Syrians decide to make an alliance with the Arabians against the Jews. And they start destroying more of what was left of Alexander Jannaeus' army. and meet Alexander in battle. But afterwards retired by mutual agreement. But when Jannaeus, when he had taken Pella, Pella was the capital of the Arabians. So while the Greek Syrians under Dionysius were fighting in the north with the help of some of Aretas's army, you see, the capital of the Arabians was in Pella. But with this agreement that the Arabians did with Greek Syrians, he moved up north to Celesyria, abandoning his capital, leaving it open for attacks. Alexander Jannaeus takes advantage of this and attacks and takes over Pella, the Arabian capital. Marcel took Gerasa again, out of the covetous desire he had out of Theodorus's possessions, and when he had built a triple wall about the garrison, he took a place by force. He also demolished Golan. Golan is in Celesyria, the land that the Greek Syrians gave to the Arabians. So this alliance between the Arabians and the Greek Syrians, instead of strengthening the Arabians, it's weakening them. Aretas is a far weaker warrior than his father Obodas was. Because where Obodas was winning battles, Aretas is now losing territory to Alexander Jannaeus. Afterwards, he had been 3 whole years in the expedition, and now he was kindly received of the nation because of the good success he had. So when he was at rest from war, he fell into distemper, for he was afflicted with a quartan egg, and supposed that by exercising himself again in martial affairs, he should get rid of his temper. But making such expeditions at unreasonable times and forcing his body to undergo greater hardships than it was able to bear, he brought himself to an end. He died, therefore, in the midst of his troubles, after he had reigned 27 years. After a reign of 27 years. So, Alexander Jannaeus, having defeated the forces of Aretas, was finally accepted by the Jewish nation. The generation that hated Alexander Jannaeus had passed on. And now there was a new generation supporting now Alexander Jannaeus. But now Alexander Jannaeus, just like his brother, he gets sick. And Alexander Jannaeus thinks that the cure for his sickness was going out to war. So, being too sick to fight, instead of going to bed to recover his strength, he thinks that his enemy's blood would be kind of like a medicine. He thinks that his sickness is due to him being back home. He goes back to continue fighting. He is too sick to fight, and he dies in the middle of battle after having ruled Israel for 27 years. Let's do the math now. He comes to the power in the year 104 minus 27. Let's see now what year this is. It is the year 77. 77 BC is where we leave this off, and where we leave off with today's transmission. I have 3 comments. Buenos días, hermano Pepe. Shalom, Manuel Juárez. Hermano Manuel, ya le he explicado mi situación varias veces. Aguárdeme, ya merito terminamos el proceso, Manuel. Y ahora, today, like everywhere else, let's remember, long live Christ the King!